Evening, everyone. It is Sunday, May 23rd, and I'm going to talk to you today about propaganda, the spin machine, the food processor of words. Well, in World War II, the Nazi Party actually had a propaganda ministry. I believe that the Allies had something similar to it, but it was labeled something different. But propaganda in the Allies' attempts at propaganda, they were more geared towards patriotism, positive reinforcement, join the military, help us win, buy war bonds, help us win, do your part, help us win. Newsreels were actually at movie theaters. You'd go in and see a movie, and first 10 minutes of the movie was a newsreel. And it was geared to show positive images of what was going on in the military and in the war to keep for lack of a better word, the momentum of the spirit of what was behind what we were doing in our war. I don't know if they were doing it in World War One. I think they probably had something similar to it, but in World War One, there was no moving pictures. It was all radio. I'm sure radio shows had advertisements, quote unquote advertisements, that would give you brief little snippets of what was going on in the war. Keep everybody apprised at home of what their loved ones were doing. During these battles, that's because these battles were overseas. The people at home didn't have any kind of physical feeling of what was going on in the war. So newsreels and stuff like that actually were easily geared to, spur feelings of patriotism, keep the faith that, loved ones were doing the right thing and they were coming home. Nazis, because their handle on the military was more iron-handed. Most of their recruits and most of their army was built on join or die, or join or die. Because it was socialism, the Nazi Socialist Party was the military was pretty much the only real industry once the war started. You had small businesses like Hofbrau's and restaurants and things like that that remained operational. The soldiers needed a place to go to unwind when they had leave. Hotel industries and stuff like that. Car industries and stuff like that were shut down to the public and re-engineered for the war machine. Everything was, any kind of industry was pretty much shut down and geared towards the war effort. As such, because of this heavy-handedness, most of the propaganda that the Nazi Party generate was, some of it was geared to, hey, let everybody know that, the Reich was going to win, and the Fuhrer was, in control of everything. He'd have regular speeches in front of vast crowds and things like that, and shows of power, demonstrations of his gloriousness. But they also had negative propaganda, meaning they geared propaganda towards basically to take the wind out of the sails of the Allies. They would capture prisoners of war, force them to do radio tapes, and say that they were treated well by the Nazi Party, and that they should, let their arms down. They're not as bad as we think they are. Stuff like that, to lower the morale of the troops, and they would broadcast this to London and to the Allied powers. Propaganda is a very, very, very powerful weapon, and as such, the American news has always kind of been, at least in modern days, had a military kind of weaponization almost. Basically, you can't really watch the news for more than, say, a week without at least seeing one news article talking about something overseas. Our brave troops doing this, that, and the other. So there's always been kind of a military wing of the news. We had a real bad tick whenever the military, instead of using soldiers to actually control the flow of the information towards back to the States and back to the Allied powers to actually keep the morale up. In the Vietnam War, they allowed outside reporters to embed with the military. Because the military had no control over these reporters, they actually reported the atrocities of war. Now, that is not what mom and pop at home want to hear or see over 5 o'clock dinner on the 5 o'clock news. Yes, war is grotesque and gruesome, but mom and pop America don't want to hear about that during, dinner. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is because these embedded reporters, they reported it and it made news, and primetime news picked it up. And thus began the American public's not appreciating what the American soldiers were doing in Vietnam. Because, unfortunately, because of the embedded reporters, they put those atrocities in their lap. During the Revolutionary War and during the Civil War, because it happened in America, this war happened in our laps. The press, the local press, would report what was happening in their local areas. I'm sure towns in the vicinity of the Civil War saw lots of atrocities and read about lots of atrocities in their local newsprint. But states to the west that did not participate in the Civil War, they had their local news. The only thing they knew about the Civil War was when presidential speeches were actually distributed as amongst the press as news releases. Revolutionary War 2. There's the growing legend that only 3% of the colonists actually participated in the Revolutionary War. Okay, well, the problem is that the war was in everybody's lap. Some people had to join because it was in their freaking backyard. They had to pick a side. It was on their land. But others who chose to just live and let live, they, whoever won, they're going to just, go to work and do their thing. That's how they wanted to live. So, had the Revolutionary War had a propaganda minister of some kind to actually, for lack of a better word, hype the war and the need for soldiers and the reason for the war. Like they hyped the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the letters of the letters of Confederacy, and all these things like that. Those works were specifically to hype the Constitution and what it meant to the citizens of America. Essentially, it was propaganda. So, what do we have now? Well, in World War II, we had a military controlled photographers that controlled news of what was going on in America, overseas in the war. So, Mom and Pop America only saw that their kids were doing good stuff. Vietnam, we had embedded civilian reporters not controlled by the military, basically telling the truth. And unfortunately, because it was told the truth, boom, we had negative connotations. Similar thing happened, and this is totally, the same vein. Everybody's heard or saw the movie with Dolly Parton, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. Well, Texas kind of always knew it had a whorehouse. And if you've watched the movie, everybody knew they had a whorehouse. But you know what? They didn't do anything about it until it was put on 5 o'clock news at dinner. Until Mom and Pop Texas and Mom and Pop America had it thrust into their lives out in the open. And then, all of a sudden, you got to get rid of it. Same situation with the Vietnam War. Okay, so what we've got now, the military doesn't have a lot of hold on the news anymore. They kind of lost it in Vietnam. The freedom of the press amendment to the Constitution actually meant something, and military, gives the press pretty much free reign. But as such, we no longer have a free press. The press is now, instead of a bastion of truth and keep the government accountable to its people, much as the government has through lobbyists, the lobbyists have now bought and control the news. And these lobbyists are fairly much corporate America, the ones who advertise on the news. The news, instead of reporting the news, they're there now to make a dollar. They've seen what reality TV can do, and now have to compete with reality TV because technically the news is the ultimate reality TV. Controlled by corporate America and their advertisers. In my actual local news, Disney owns CBS. CBS is our local news, is one of our three local news stations. So a corporate movie production agency or mogul owns a news agency. So they are now slaves to that corporation. They no longer report the news in its entirety. They report the news that is spun by the corporations. Much like because the military controlled the news in World War II to where it filtered what was going on overseas to a mom and pop America, the news now goes through a corporate filter. So, yes, propaganda is very, very real, guys. We're at 21 minutes, so looks like I'm going to have to stop for now. We will continue this in video number 2. Later, Gator.